The cruise industry was a booming growth market until 2020. Holidays at sea were particularly popular with German tourists. No other nation in Europe went on board more often. At the beginning of the 20th century, Hamburg was a rapidly growing major city with international trade connections. The economic prosperity was also reflected in the rapidly growing population. Shipping lines led from the largest port in continental Europe to the whole world.
Hamburg in the Wilhelminian time, the time of Kaiser Wilhelm II, developed into a world port. This had a lot to do with the fact that Germany had developed considerable seafaring activity during that period, and not only in the naval sector. Few people know that this was especially true for merchant shipping, and Germany built up an enormous world trade, which had far less to do with the colonies than with the fact that you simply had merchants all over the world, had trading companies all over the world, that you became an enormous industrial nation in this period of direct competition with England. And Hamburg became a world port and the largest German port in this period. Before World War I, Hamburg was the fourth largest port in the world.
At this time, Albert Berlin was in the service of the Hamburg American Paketfahr-Aktiengesellschaft, Hapag for short. In January 1891, this young head of the passage department organized an excursion that caused a sensation.
The story you always hear is that Albert Berlin came up with the idea of the cruise. He said, we can't fill the ships to capacity in the winter months because people in steerage don't like to cross the Atlantic in winter. It's just the same today, in fact, with crossing still rather unpleasant in the very stormy travel conditions of winter. And then it just occurred to him that one could address oneself to the upper class, to the better earners of the time, those more concerned with luxurious journeys than with reaching goals, and where it was more about the joy of seeing something of the world. And this was also, of course, for those who could afford it, a huge prestige builder. I go on a trip like this because I can afford it.
At the end of January 1891, the Augusta Victoria set sail from Cuxhaven with 241 passengers, the first luxury cruise in history.
Berlin then had the idea that he would like to offer such a trip in the winter regularly. And that idea actually belongs to the term cruise, that one wants to make it regularly, again and again. And he worked that out, very personally, always with great effort, and then initiated the first luxury cruise in the world and carried it out.
The almost 2 months cruise to the Mediterranean became a great success. A press artist documented the adventures of the passengers on this pioneering voyage. At a stroke, it made Hapag the world's leading cruise shipping company.
The Augusta Victoria was not yet a cruise ship. It was a passenger ship that was used for the purpose of a cruise. And it didn't come about until around 10 years later that they celebrated the success of this new idea with the Princess Victoria Louise, which was the first cruise ship in the world built just for that purpose.
Nearby Bremen was home to the second major German shipping company. There, on the 20th of February 1857, Norddeutsche Lloyd was founded, NDL for short. Under the leadership of Heinrich Wiegand, NDL became a serious competitor to Hapag in Hamburg.
Hapag and Norddeutsche Lloyd were simply the two main competitors in Germany, but also the largest German shipping companies on the world market. They were able to position themselves very well and very successfully. And of course, luxury and quality and reliability of shipping certainly spoke for themselves even at that time, and in some cases set new standards worldwide.
The mutual outbidding of the two major shipping companies, Hapag and Norddeutsche Lloyd, drove world shipping decisively forward. Nowhere was this more evident than on the lucrative transatlantic route between Europe and the USA. An important line of business on the crossing to the United States was the passage business, the transportation of immigrants.
The transatlantic route was primarily interesting because you had masses of emigrants going to North America, but also, to a not inconsiderable extent, to South America. And the shipping companies made far more money with that at the time than with business travelers, or with people who tended to travel in luxury first class. That was the business of these shipping companies in the time of the emigrant waves, so late 19th, early 20th century.
In Hamburg, the Hapag emigrant halls were a gathering point for the growing number of immigrants. Here, strict health checks took place, which were mandatory for emigration. People often waited for weeks to be allowed to board a ship.
The emigrants had to cross over somehow. If they made it, they wanted to see their homeland again. So a greater demand for these modes of transportation developed automatically from year to year.
To better market its cruises, Hapag had been operating its own tourist agency in Berlin since 1905. The first travel office of the Hamburg US line was located at number 8 Unter den Linden. Not far from there, Norddeutsche Lloyd also opened its own world travel office.
One of the great classic trips of that time was the Nordlandreise, the northern route, and that certainly came about because it was the German emperor who always liked to spend his holidays on that route. And back then was a time when people didn't have so many role models, no pop stars to emulate. It was simply the most exciting thing for people to follow the emperor, with the chance that one might even see his yacht on the same route. That certainly drew people strongly to the north, which then simply became a classic destination and worked even without the emperor.
In May 1912, Emperor Wilhelm II was in Hamburg for the magnificent christening of the Imperator. The largest ship in the world at the time was launched at the Vulcan shipyard at a cost of 40 million Reichsmarks. After completion of the luxury liner, the maiden voyage to New York began a year later.
Hapag and Norddeutsche Lloyd were actually the largest shipping companies around in terms of the number of passengers carried in the years before the First World War. On the North Atlantic and thereabouts, the competition was then to have the largest ships in the world, to have the most luxurious ships in the world. And even then, to not get left behind, you absolutely had to achieve first place.
Albert Ballin shaped Hapag into the world's largest shipping company before the First World War. His motto, "My field is the world," is still present at Hapag-Lloyd headquarters today. It is intended as a reminder of the general manager who once anticipated globalization. As a result of its defeat in the First World War, the German Reich had to hand over most of its merchant fleet to the victorious powers. German passenger shipping, in particular, suffered under the Treaty of Versailles. There was no longer any German overseas shipping.
The large ships had to be handed over to the victorious powers as reparations. And I believe that other ships also had to stop at 1,000 tons. Nothing greater was allowed. But at the beginning of the 20s it started up again, and then in the golden 20s, before the world economic crisis of '29, it picked up quite a bit of speed. By then, things were going very well again for the Germans, even in the traditional area of cruising.
At the end of 1922, the first Hapag passenger ship of the post-war period, the Albert Ballin, was launched. The steamships were now smaller than before the war, but more technically sophisticated.
The Ballin class, those were great ships. They were a class of 4, and some of these lived to be 70 years old before being scrapped. And they were ordered quite deliberately in the early 1920s so that they could be retrofitted at any time, enabling them to be in service continuously following their launch. And so they were great money makers, both in cargo and in passenger shipping.
In July 1923, the Albert Ballin embarked on her maiden voyage to New York. A special advertising film of the Hamburg America line presented the advantages of a crossing. At that time, the third class was still designed for immigrants in order to enable poorer classes to make the crossing to the New World. Nevertheless, the passengers didn't have to do without comfort. In second class, passengers could enjoy contemporary comforts. In addition to an extensive entertainment program, they could also expect a wide range of services and their own onboard newspaper.
They thought of the comfort they could give to other classes of the population, those who didn't have so much money, and the possibilities for such journeys originated in the 1920s. And of course, if you took the focus away from the high speed, where it was just about who was the fastest across the Atlantic, 5 days, 4 days, then one could think about how to make things more comfortable.
On board, luxury service was reserved for first-class passengers. In addition to a hairdresser, services included childcare and an extensive fitness program. Thus, the ambience of the time also exuded a certain generosity. This was particularly evident in the tastefully furnished lounges. In addition, the Albert Berlin had a clever technical innovation.
Tell me, where sind diese...
Sie meinen die Schlingertanks?
Oh yes, Slingertanks.
Gerade hier unter uns, an der Wasserlinie, befinden sich die Außenbordöffnungen der Schlingerdämpfungstanks. Diese Öffnungen sind an beiden Seitenwänden des Schiffes. Man sieht deutlich die ausströmenden Wassermengen. Diese Wassertanks sind durch einen Luftkanal miteinander verbunden. Hier das Ventil zum An- und Abstellen der Schlingertanks. Die Welle sucht das Schiff im Sinne dieser Pfeilrichtung zum Überholen zu bringen. Das Gewicht des eingeströmten Seewassers wirkt dem entgegen und sichert dem Schiff diese stabile Lage.
Oh, wonderful. Nie mehr seekrank. Ich fahre nie mehr mit einem Schiff ohne diese...
Schlingertanks.
Yes, Slingertanks.
Thanks to this invention, Hapag was able to advertise ships without seasickness for the first time. After a crossing of about 7 days, the Albert Berlin reached the port of New York, where she was already eagerly awaited at the mooring pier of 44th Street.
Of course, people's longing to make such a trip was unchecked. As soon as people had recovered from the everyday worries of the immediate post-war hardship, the desire to travel started again. And in the Roaring '20s, Germany, like the rest of the world, experienced a measurable, strong economic upswing, which was then naturally reflected in people's desire to travel.
Since 1871, the Hamburg South American Steamship Company, known as Hamburg Süd, had been based in the Hanseatic city. In the 20s, it organized a wide variety of cruises. The popular Nordland tours had enjoyed a legendary reputation among Germans since imperial times. With its Monte-class steamers, Hamburg Süd offered inexpensive and comfortable travel options. Their one-class service became a model. In the summer of 1925, the Peine family from Hanover also went on a trip to the north. They documented their 15-day cruise on the Monte Sarmiento in detail in a travel diary.
This facility for up to 1,100 or 1,200 was, I believe, the largest occupancy with passengers all housed in uniform basic classes, but at least comfortable enough that they could later be used as cabins for cruise ships.
As early as 1921, Hamburg Süd succeeded in buying back the proud Cap Polonio from England. After a general overhaul, she became the shipping company's flagship.
Hamburg Süd was particularly successful in the South American line, where it also received certain privileges for trade as such from the Brazilian emperor, which was normally only done between states. They were able to position themselves very well and very successfully there.
On the 16th of February 1922, the Cap Polonio could finally start its maiden voyage to South America after several years of delay. More than 1,500 passengers could be accommodated on board the elegant luxury liner in 2 classes and the tween deck.
One can say about the Cap ships that they basically began with the Cap Polonio on the South Atlantic route. In terms of reliability, speed, luxury, they really set new standards, and then also stood for the fact that Hamburg Süd really had something to offer people at that time.
21-year-old Oskar Otto Lehmann also took part in the maiden voyage of the Cap Polonio. In January 22, he joined Hamburg Süd as a steward. For more than 17 years, Lehmann worked on various ships of the shipping company. His last voyage ended on board the Cap Arcona in Hamburg on the 9th of September 1939. Since her commissioning at the end of 1927, the Cap Arcona had become known as the Queen of the South Atlantic. She covered the route from Hamburg to Buenos Aires in 15 days. There was room for more than 1,300 passengers on board.
These were Hamburg Süd's flagships. So, flagship meant the largest and most magnificent, and usually also the fastest ship. And the Cap Arcona, as the last of these units, which was built in 1927, was the largest and fastest ship on the South America route throughout her life.
At the end of the 1920s, North German Lloyd reached a new technical dimension with its fast steamers Bremen and Europa. By combining size and speed, the shipping company aimed to regain its leading position in North Atlantic traffic. Both luxury liners were able to meet expectations on their maiden voyage. They won the blue ribbon for the fastest North Atlantic crossing.
They were large ships. That is, the largest fast steamers on the North Atlantic, and, as it turned out, also the fastest, in which for the first time 2 very great technological and also aesthetic advances had been made. The streamlined shape, the entire ship streamlined through. And then they were the first ships to have this bow bulge. And the bow bulge provided 1 or 2 knots more speed, because it distributed the water in such a favorable way that it really brought this saving.
The Bremen and her sister ship Europa were considered the most modern fast steamers in the world in their time. It took them less than 5 days to cross the Atlantic from Bremerhaven to New York. The elegant ships were also very popular with over 2,200 passengers, as they offered a combination of luxury and speed. The Bremen completed nearly 190 round trips across the ocean in her more than 10 years of service. The National Socialists had been in power since 1933. They soon founded the organization Strength Through Joy, aimed at organizing the leisure time of the German nation, which also included cruises. As early as May 1937, the launching of the first new Strength Through Joy ship, Wilhelm Gustloff, could be celebrated in the presence of Adolf Hitler.
Bei Blom und Voss in Hamburg liegt das erste KdF-Urlauberschiff von Stapel, auf dem deutsche Arbeiter auf weiten Fahrten in fremde Länder Erholung finden werden.
Was gestern noch Gedanken waren, Fantasien für viele, Romantik für andere, ist nun Tatsache geworden. Es ist schon etwas unerhört Großes. Es ist einmalig und erstmalig in der Welt, dass es ein Staat, eine Gemeinschaft unternimmt, für Arbeiter ein Schiff, ein so großes, ein so schönes Schiff zu bauen.
I christen you Wilhelm Gustloff.
The Wilhelm Gustloff was the largest ship in the world built for cruisers up to that time. Its use as a pleasure ship for workers and employees found an international echo.
Of course, the Gustloff was a very large ship. As far as I know, it was the largest of the KDF ships, and thus naturally had a flagship function. But it was modern, it was beautiful, it was big. Of course, it was also advertised accordingly, and perhaps even more than the other KDF ships, it stood for the fact that the new regime was now making you, the population, this wonderful offer. Now, finally, for everyone. And that certainly had a great effect on the people, because such propaganda then, of course, caught on at some point.
In Hamburg harbor at the end of April 1938, the Wilhelm Gustloff was ready to set sail. A short time later, she began her spring cruise to Lisbon and Madeira, which was advertised as a maiden voyage.
These cruises were popular because now a class of people could go to sea that otherwise would never have thought of it, namely the proles, the workers. They never had enough money to afford such an option. And the Nazis took advantage of that and built these ships. That in itself was a social act. They could travel and were therefore happy that they were allowed to travel.
A vacation on a KDF ship was one of the most popular vacation wishes of the working population in the Nazi Empire. Under the motto, "Rejoice in life," around 700,000 people had taken advantage of the organized offer of a sea voyage by August 1939.
There were morning roll calls and all kinds of things. It was all a little bit like that, but that's what people were used to back then anyway, from childhood. That you had to stand to attention a little bit. So that's what made it work. And at first it was disused passenger ships that were used for this purpose. And then new ones were built. And they then started attracting attention and also recognition all over the world.
One of the highlights of a spring cruise was the Portuguese capital Lisbon. In the 30s, these European holiday destinations were in high demand, and the waiting lists were correspondingly long.
The KDF journeys, of course, continued the idea of the one-class ship from the 1920s, but then, of course, enriched the whole thing with the ideology of the Nazi state, which, of course, wanted to have a reward system for the people, which was, of course, for propaganda purposes. Look what we offer you. And if you then look at these trips and the programs, there was ideology in it everywhere, in the form of joint activities, in which one then, of course, obligingly took part.
These impressions of the port of Hamburg come from the enthusiastic amateur filmmaker Kurt Lehfeldt, shot in May 1938. In the same year, the Nazi community Kraft durch Freude sent 10.5 million people on journeys across Europe. On the 13th of May 1939, the Hapag steamer St. Louis set sail from Hamburg for Cuba. On board were 937 Jewish immigrants who wanted to emigrate to Havana because of Nazi persecution. After a fortnight's crossing, the ship reached its port of destination, but the authorities refused them entry. Captain Gustav Schröder pleaded for the passengers to be allowed to land in the USA or Canada. When both countries refused to help, an odyssey began.
During this trip, he became a man full of heart, who decided to really save these people. First, Cuba had refused them entry. He then tried to get them into the USA and Canada, and only when that failed, he had to think about the return journey, and thus there were further negotiations with Schröder. And then these people were finally accepted at the last moment in France, Benelux and Great Britain. And for that, Schröder then became known for this rescue mission, to which he was extremely committed.
After a 5-week odyssey, the St. Louis received permission to land in Antwerp. From there, the immigrants were allowed to continue their journey to other European countries. The St. Louis, like her sister ship, the Milwaukee, had been in service with the Hamburg America line since 1909. Shortly after the drama of the St. Louis, Franziska Braun booked a trip to the North Country in Munich. At the end of June 1939, she arrived in Hamburg with her 2 daughters to board the Milwaukee. The 2 young women were enthusiastic film amateurs and had their camera and color films in their luggage to document the voyage.
The Hamburg America line had converted ships like the Milwaukee into cruise ships several times during the early 30s. But in 1936, she stood absolutely on her own as a luxury cruise ship. And that's where Eva Braun went.
The then 27-year-old Eva Braun was the mistress of Adolf Hitler. Only very few Germans knew of her existence. In a familiar circle, she enjoyed the luxurious cruise to the north. Attractions along the itinerary via Iceland, Spitsbergen and Norway were the shore excursions and encounters with the local population.
The Nordland cruises were among the most popular with all passengers, long before there were Nazis and Kaiser Wilhelms. And to this day they still want to do a Nordland cruise. People love them because it's a tremendous adventure when you take such a cruise.
Even then, the traditional Nordland voyages were among the top cruises offered by German shipping companies. For Eva Braun and company, the 16-day Nordland tour on the Milwaukee ended on the 13th of July 1939 back in Hamburg.
It's perhaps also the case that people developed a certain romantic relationship with Norway, because you could drive all the way to the North Cape, the end of Europe. There's something about that, of course, where everyone wants to have stood or been. And apart from that, what you can see there was also extremely scenic.
In the 1930s, the Cap Arcona regularly moored at Hamburg's Überseebrücke. During this time, Hamburg Süd held a monopoly position in South American trade, which also had an effect on passenger numbers. Among other things, the Queen of the South Atlantic operated the liner service between Hamburg, Madeira, Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires.
Then I saw the Cap Arcona, the largest ship in South American service, which was slowly steaming out of its harbor. And when she passed the Hamburg piers, which were only a few tens of meters away, the band played a famous song, must I leave Hamburg? And people waved, and some sang along. That was such a moving story to me that I've never forgotten it.
During the Second World War, the Cap Arcona was used by the German Navy and sunk by British fighter bombers in the Bay of Lübeck as late as May 1945.
Im Hamburger Hafen liegt der 16.000 Tonnen große Passagierdampfer St. Louis, ausgebrannt und von Bomben zerschlagen. Das Schiff ist nicht mehr seetüchtig. Als landtüchtig kann es noch gelten. Die erhalten gebliebenen Kabinen und Räume wurden daher zu einem Hotel mit 200 Betten umgebaut. Ein ehemaliger Kapitän führt als Hoteldirektor das Schiff im Hafen. Wie in einem großen Hotel gibt es auch einen Speisesaal, ein Rauchzimmer und einen Salon. Sogar Friseurstuben sind vorhanden. Die Hapag, der das Schiff gehört, hat also für allen Komfort gesorgt. Auf dem Achterdeck genießen die Gäste Sonne und Seeluft mit einem großen Vorteil. Sie können nie seekrank werden.
Since June 1945, the port of Hamburg had been cleared of war damage to the extent that limited shipping traffic was possible again. But many harbor basins were still blocked by countless mines and shipwrecks.
At the end of the war, there were 3,000 wrecks in the port of Hamburg alone, not all of which were so badly damaged that it would not have been worthwhile to lift and repair them. And getting ships back into service so quickly was, of course, much more cost-effective than completely rebuilding everything and then scrapping all these old ships.
While Allied supply ships could once again moor in Hamburg, Germany remained excluded from world shipping until 1949. At the end of 1946, the British were able to send the Queen Elizabeth on her first post-war voyage to New York. On board the world's largest passenger ship, service was a top priority, and the bellhops were no exception.
Berühmtheiten gehen an Bord. Der amerikanische Senator Connelly, der an der Pariser Friedenskonferenz teilnahm. Und der sowjetische Außenminister Molotow, der zur Außenministerkonferenz nach New York fährt. Power los! Die 83.000 Tonnen bewegen sich. Schlepper übernehmen das Riesenschiff und dann laufen die Maschinen an zur ersten Fahrt im Friedensgewand. Als Truppentransporter hat die Queen Elizabeth schon 500.000 Meilen im Kriege bewältigt. Jetzt holt sie die Jungfernfahrt als Fahrgastdampfer nach. Als größtes und schönstes Schiff der Welt.
The Berlin was the first German North Atlantic passenger ship following the Second World War. Up to 1,000 guests could be accommodated on board the former Gripsholm. Since February 1954, the ship had been sailing between Bremerhaven and New York.
An important prerequisite was that the political climate had simply changed and the victorious powers had removed the restrictions that had been imposed on Germany in the first post-war years. And then, of course, contacts one already had. Cruising areas that were classics came into their own again, not least because the people who wanted to sail on the German side naturally made use of these ships again, made these journeys again. But foreign passengers also remembered the good reputation that German ships already had internationally in the pre-war period.
Since the 1950s, the GDR had been building up its own merchant fleet, the aim being to secure overseas transport for the shipment of goods. By the early 1970s, the Comrades succeeded in returning to the world's oceans as a major seafaring nation. From February 1960, the GDR population was able to sail on the holiday ship Völkerfreundschaft, friendship among nations. The prerequisite for this was a so-called voyage check, which was given to deserving working people. In the winter months, the route usually went from Warnemünde via Rhodes and Piraeus to Constanza on the Black Sea. From 1961, trips to Cuba were also possible. 568 passengers could be accommodated on board. In the 60s, cruises were not yet a mass phenomenon in tourism. In the summer of 1967, Georg Braxmeier from Neu-Ulm boarded a ship in Genoa for a cruise lasting several weeks. The longed-for destination was Istanbul. A passenger ship took him through the Mediterranean via Corfu, Rhodes, and along the Bosphorus to the former Constantinople.
Since its beginnings, cruising has been highly regarded. You can't get it out of people's minds if you like, it's simply popular. And I can only imagine that's because we're a people who love to travel, and not just us Germans. Of course, this also applies to other countries where the economic situation makes it possible for people to afford to travel on a large scale. But people just like to look at the world.
On the 9th of July 1959, the Bremen set sail on her maiden voyage from Bremerhaven to New York. She was the last top-of-the-line ship of the North German Lloyd Company on the North Atlantic. Steadily declining passenger numbers and the increase in air traffic forced the company to come up with new ideas. At the end of the 60s, the company focused on cruises and finally ended the North Atlantic service.
The discontinuation of the passenger service was due to the fact that gradually everyone was now traveling by plane and not by ship. And in terms of price, it was already cheaper to travel by plane. So there was no longer any reason to keep it alive. And then they came up with the obvious idea of using the ships that were still in good condition for cruises, or converting them for this purpose, so that cruises basically owe their breakthrough, to a very small extent, to this discontinuation of scheduled services.
For economic reasons, Hapag and North German Lloyd merged to form Hapag-Lloyd Limited in 1970. This ended the more than 100-year history of the two shipping companies. New York, 1979. The Queen Elizabeth II was ready to sail. In stormy seas, it headed out into the Atlantic. Also on board was German industrial manager Hans-Olaf Henkel with his wife and daughter Helene. The family recorded their impressions on the Cunard cruise liner with a film camera.
It's the case that people still like to travel on British ships today, because this element of everything very British is still seen as a tourist magnet. The people dress in a special way, that they travel in a certain style.
The Atlantic crossing of the Queen Elizabeth II ended after just 4 days in Cherbourg, France. This was also where Hans-Olaf Henkel and his family disembarked. Since the 1980s, international cruise tourism has grown into a boom industry. German tourists in particular appreciate the variety of destinations on a single voyage. According to a survey by the International Cruise Association, CLIA, many German citizens are so enthusiastic about holidaying on the high seas that they want to book the cruise again.
It's fair to say that we've seen a cruise boom in the last 20, 25 years. The shipping companies have done the business cleverly, because they still create offers for everyone, meaning also for the small purse, in fascinating worldwide destinations. In other words, they have such a colourful bouquet of exotic or European offerings that almost anyone can afford them.
German dream destinations are a trip around the world and the Caribbean region. A mixture of traditional cruising and adventure is offered by tall ships like the Royal Clipper. With her 5,200 square meters of sail area, she reaches a speed of 20 knots. This makes her not only the largest, but also the fastest windjammer in the world. The Royal Clipper has been regularly cruising the Caribbean since 2000. At that time, Captain Ulrich Prüsse was in command of the 5-masted full-rigged ship.
Every time we come in, of course, we are the star. Our ship is always the focal point. Everyone is looking, and the feeling that you have a beautiful ship and can be seen with a ship makes you proud. And why not?
Macht einen stolz und warum auch nicht?
Up to 227 passengers can be accommodated on board the Royal Clipper. Also for 2021, the Monegasque shipping company Star Clippers offers trips to the Caribbean. For example, a sailing trip from Barbados along the Grenadine Islands with a 7-day overnight stay is said to cost around €2,300.
If you look at what one generation has already experienced and the one that's even younger, the exotic countries they're already traveling to, backpacking through Thailand or traveling in the Andes, with globalization, people today simply have the opportunity to get to the remotest corners of the world much more quickly and much more cheaply and safely. For young people, of course, this is an amazing experience to go where you wouldn't normally be able to go. So cleverly done, if you will, by those who are responsible for the programs.
The ever-growing cruise business was always particularly popular with Germans. Until the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, they were the 3rd largest cruiser nation.
Einmal den Seeteufel.
In addition to individual service, entertainment and leisure events such as aqua parks are also popular. A special maritime outdoor activity is the high ropes course on the Norwegian breakaway. In the battle for cruise holidaymakers, the shipping companies are outbinding each other with elaborate attractions. The target group is a younger clientele and families.
This is so awesome. This is so awesome. You can't imagine this. There's just nothing underneath you anymore. That's so rad.
Yes, they've introduced new entertainment elements on cruise ships from year to year that didn't used to exist on ships at all. Amazing things that are completely superfluous in reality. But they were brought to the attention of the masses to such an extent that the demand remained there.
TUI Cruises regularly organizes the full metal cruise on its Mein Schiff liners. Up to 2,000 heavy metal fans can take part in Europe's loudest cruise spectacle. An inside cabin on the 5-day tour costs around 1,300 euros, full metal drinks included.
That's the next idea then, that you do a kind of theme tour where it's then maybe less about the specialty and more about enjoying something together. So these hard rock and heavy metal cruises are also well known to me. And just a little less hardcore is Udo Lindenberg's highly famous Rob liner, which also sails from Hamburg. That's a huge business and probably exists for other interest groups as well. And that's part of this boom, of course, to make cruising even more interesting by serving special interest groups with special programs.
There is no dress code or seating assignment on these fun cruises.
The classic cruise has basically been abolished with these big ships. The classic cruise meant that you had to wear at least a suit to dinner. And at festivities, that is, at any shipboard parties, you had to wear a tuxedo. Today, if a lady wants to take a seat at the bar with pants that are too tight or without a brassiere, she is politely refused, but that's all there is to it. Otherwise, everyone can dress how they want.
There was a public festival atmosphere in 2005 in Hamburg when the Queen Mary II moored in the harbour. The flagship of the Cunard Shipping Company regularly visited the Hanseatic city before her crossing to New York. But before that, the Queen of the Seas had to be turned through 180 degrees in the narrow harbour basin so that she could later set sail again on her own. A nautical challenge. The Queen Mary II is the last scheduled transatlantic liner. With an unforgettable parade, the Hanseatic city bids farewell to the luxury liner. Hamburg was turned upside down.
Everyone's crazy about Mary. Before Corona, it was going like hotcakes. In the end, of course, the environmental aspect was also taken into account, and it became clear that these ships are not unproblematic from the point of view of climate protection, and ship owners will naturally rethink this and favour cleaner propulsion systems in the future.
Hardly any business has slowed down due to the COVID virus as much as cruises. 2019 saw over 3 million ship travellers from Germany alone. But the spread of the pandemic was followed by a standstill. Around 400 cruise ships had to be taken out of service in 2020 worldwide.
This is really a blow, like the global economic crisis last time, where you had to completely put the fleets on hold and then had to figure out how do we move forward and from when? Who's going to survive? Even from when are we back to the status quo in terms of business success?
For cruise fans, things are tentatively moving forward with the introduction of strict hygiene measures. But the recovery of the formerly booming fun industry on water to pre-COVID levels is going to take a long time.